A bombshell revelation. Government documents show U.S. officials misled the American public about the war in Afghanistan. Hi, I'm Sean Calebs, filling in for Aden Naidu, and this is The Heat. A trove of documents obtained by the Washington Post newspaper detail how 3 U.S. presidents and their military commanders falsified reports about making progress in Afghanistan. Quote, "We didn't know what we were doing," said one Army general in the papers. After 18 years of instability and violence, there is still no end in sight to the longest armed conflict in U.S. history. The disclosures come as U.S. President Donald Trump is expected to announce a partial troop withdrawal. The administration is also hoping for a peace deal with the Taliban. So lots to unpack here. Let's get straight to our panel. Joining us from Kabul, Mushtaq Rahim, founding member of the Afghanistan Affairs Unit. Richard Becker joins us from San Francisco. He is the West Coast coordinator for the Act Now to Stop War and End Racism Coalition. And with us here in Washington, D.C., John Sitilides. He is a global risk analyst and a consultant with the U.S. State Department. Also in Kabul, Intizar Khadim. He is the director of the Center for Development and Peace Studies. Gentlemen, I want to thank you all. Mushtaq, I want to begin by starting with you, talking about the exhaustive information that is out there. And if you listen to people, it really sort of paints a picture of misrepresentation and deception. How is this being digested in Afghanistan?
As far as the release of information is concerned, or the discussion about misinformation is concerned, it wasn't a surprise here in Kabul for those who follow the Afghan affairs. And the reason behind that is that amidst all this chaos that has been happening in Afghanistan since 2001, where the strategies have been changing so frequently, the vision for future in Afghanistan as far as the engagement of international community is concerned have been a moving target all the times. If you look at these practices, it wasn't much of a surprise because we have been seeing all this happening in the country going back to 2001. Since then, in all spheres of life, in all spheres of governance, in all spheres of development work in Afghanistan, there have been changing tactics, changing positions, changing strategies, as a result of which we have been seeing fatal mistakes being committed by the international partners of Afghanistan. So wasn't much of a surprise, but yes, the forward that it has created, the new discussion that has emerged as a result of release of these papers, there is an expectation that it will have a positive impact as far as the outlook and future visioning for Afghanistan is concerned. We believe that Washington will reconsider its tactics and its strategies for Afghanistan and try to come up with something more cohesive and comprehensive that can help the country get out of the situation, the crisis it has been facing.
Intizar, I want to follow up with you because I've been there several times reporting, and I've talked with officials, both Afghan and U.S. and international, that in essence say that corruption is a much a threat to Afghanistan as the Taliban. So do you think the fact that these papers are now out there for everyone to read, is that going to have any effect moving forward, both from the Afghan point of view and the U.S. point of view?
Well, I think I'm really concerned about the foundation in the objective that has been happening in Afghanistan since 2001 in Afghanistan. I think there has been a lot of mistakes. There have been mistake of strategy. There have been mistake of objective. I remember Robert Gates in his book Security at War, he said that we should have narrowed down our objective in Afghanistan. President Bush was quite a surprise. He came with 4 bigger macro war type of few objectives in Afghanistan, for example, like economic development. For example, fighting terrorism in making Afghanistan not a safe haven for terrorism, human rights and all these things. And this has been like a pipe dream. If you do not have a foundation for something, if you do not know how to do the job, putting such big objective in a war country like Afghanistan was just a fantasy. There is a Chinese trope. They say that if you do not know where you go, you will never know when you reach. And that was quite a practical scenario in Afghanistan. Since 2001, there was quite opacity in Afghanistan and things were not clear. Tommy Franks was quite a surprise. All of a sudden came to Afghanistan and started the war. And today we are suffering and pay the price of the mistake we have been occurring in the last 18 years.
Well, Richard, let's talk about the U.S. goal. Remember, the U.S. got in right after 9/11, basically to quench this desire for revenge after the 9/11 attacks here. The goal was stability, security, transparency, all very ambitious, as we just heard. But I want to quote one general who has written, or was quoted in the Afghan Papers, Douglas Lute. "We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing." So do you think the U.S. made a miscalculation?
Well, I don't know if it was a miscalculation, but I know that it was really a crime against the people of Afghanistan. The Answer Coalition, which I'm part of, had the first demonstrations the day after the invasion happened, and we've been opposed to it ever since. And I think that the Afghanistan Papers make it clear that this has been nothing but an exercise in killing and destruction and corruption. You know, it's really something that today there's going to be the impeachment vote, but it's not going to be discussing at all the real crimes and what's been done to Afghanistan, as well as what's been done to Iraq, what's been done in Yemen. These are the real crimes, war crimes, against the peoples of those countries. And there's not going to be a solution that is imposed by Washington and by the Pentagon. The answer to this has to be that the Afghani people have to determine their own future. The people of Afghanistan are the only ones who can successfully determine that.
Okay, John, I imagine you have a different take on that, but before that, I want to talk about what's in the Afghan Papers about bribery and corruption, and quote Ryan Crocker, who a former ambassador to Afghanistan, and in the spirit of full disclosure, I worked for the U.S. State Department in 2011. I was in Afghanistan, and Ryan Crocker was, in essence, my boss. Here's what he said. You just cannot put those amounts of money into a very fragile state and society and not have it fuel corruption. You just can't. And so the takeaway is that much of the money used to fund the war on terror is alleged to have flowed to contractors and private security firms. What can the U.S. look at now and say, or anybody look at now and say, this is where Afghanistan is compared to 18 years ago?
I think one of the first things you need to do is to make sure that you have the right mission and that you stay on that mission. I mean, let's remember why we were in Afghanistan in the first place, right? It was to deter any future catastrophic terrorist attack like the one that killed 3,000 Americans in 2001, and also to deter other governments from harboring al-Qaeda or similar terrorist organizations as the Taliban had done in Afghanistan. But I think also in the months after the invasion, we began to think about what happened in Afghanistan that allowed these conditions to breed. And there was all of this policy debate in Washington and other Western capitals about the West, so-called abandoning Afghanistan after the Soviet Union was defeated in 1989. We abandoned it, we left it into a vacuum, and that's where al-Qaeda and Taliban were able to come in. So how do we now nation build? We brought in a new mission into Afghanistan to prevent this kind of abandonment and the creation of a vacuum that terrorist organizations can fill. Once we veered off of that track of the initial focus, I think it was just one colossal error after the other. And to your point, Sean, I think the fact that we now have what many recognize as a kleptocracy in many components of the Kabul government, and also the fact that you have a centralized government effort in a country that is really governed by tribes. And we've failed to recognize the importance of understanding the political culture in Afghanistan that was always going to be hostile to a powerful central government in Kabul.
And Intizar, the carrot and the stick has always been, let's get peace negotiations going. Let's negotiate with the Taliban and make things happen. Where do you think the Afghanistan stands now in terms of those discussions? And do you think all this publicity is going to have any adverse effect to the discussions, or is it just simply outside chatter?
Well, I think there should be a difference between peace and sustainable peace. And there should be a difference between my way or highway in the current peace negotiation. I think there have been a number of mistakes. So far, we're not clear whether we're dealing with the Taliban an exit plan or a peace deal. that's quite different objectives, and that's why quite different processes. For the time being, the American government, including Ambassador Khalilzad, he's not quite clear on that part. So far, for the last 10 rounds that the discussion have been happening between the Taliban leadership and the American government, still the peace efforts sputters. I mean, there is no really a light at the end of the tunnel. But we Afghans understand that there is no other option on table without making a deal with the Taliban, and they should be part of the Afghan government. But the difference is whether Taliban will be defeating the American forces in the international community and they will be prevailing over the power, economy, politics, and everything, whether they will be integrating in the current structure or whether they will be part of the power sharing structure of political power. So I think that these things should be different, and they should be categorized by the American people in the Afghan government. Still, there is unclarity on that part, and I hope that should be cleared in the future, in coming months.
Mushtaq, to follow up with you, the Afghanistan Papers basically describe former Afghan President Hamid Karzai as someone who's self-organized into kleptocracy. And Hamid Karzai talked about that himself, reacted to it. Here's what he had to say.
I think the only reason that we see now for those to have been lying and undermining Afghanistan and trying to keep us weak and trying to keep us at war and trying to promote corruption is to keep us in conflict in which they were trying to do their own things. Whatever those things are, well, you ask them. We see it as rivalry with global powers. We see it as using Afghanistan as a huge land base for their operations globally against major powers.
Mushtaq, your take on that. Do you agree with President Karzai?
Basically, what I can say that President Karzai got at loggerheads with its American partner, which became during his era, where he signed a strategic partnership agreement with as well. He remained at contrast with the Americans on many issues. And the reason is that because these mistakes that we have been discussing and which have been reported by these Afghanistan papers as well. For example, instead of supporting strengthening the governance, the international community invested in warlords through giving them contracts, through offering them open money via the provincial reconstruction teams, where the Afghan government was not involved in certain decisions, such as talking to the Taliban behind the curtain. The politics that was where the Americans engaged with the Pakistanis vis-a-vis the Afghan peace process. And that is where the coordination, the sync was lost between President Karzai and the American government, the Obama administration in particular, which put both the parties at differences with each other, which resulted in further deterioration of the situation and enlarging the crisis that both parties were facing at that time. As far as President Karzai is concerned, he has always been, starting from 2009, 2010, where he faced the Americans, where he saw the Americans, particularly the special rep of the U.S. administration for Afghanistan, Richard Holbrooke, who interfered in Afghan elections, where the UNA Maher Qaide, as well as President Karzai, were not in sync. They were against each other. And President Karzai saw the Americans to be working against him. He has some valid points to raise. Right. He has some certain concerns which one has to agree with. But in general, yes, these differences of opinions occurred because of these fatal mistakes, these continuous mistakes, which resulted in this situation. Now, coming back, I want to say a couple of sentences on the tribal groups fighting the central government. I tend to disagree with this one because it was not the tribal groups that were fighting the central government. It was the warlords that got fortified with the American money, international money, and then they turned against the central government because they enjoyed so much power, so much leverage, they had so much say in regional affairs that they always disregarded the central government. So again, I want to put the blame on the mistakes that were part of this whole approach in stabilizing Afghanistan.
Richard, I want to ask you a few things. One, when Karzai took office, there were 900,000 kids in school, all boys. Today, there are close to 8 million. Roads, water treatment plants, other things have been built. But there are a couple of dates that are important. 2003, when the U.S. invaded Iraq and arguably took their eye off the ball in what was going on in Afghanistan, and then the huge troop surge by former U.S. President Obama in the late 2000s, late 2008, 9, 10. Let's talk about that and compare the Afghan papers to the well-known Pentagon Papers. Do you think there's any comparison, or do you think the Pentagon Papers were so much more significant?
Well, I think that what we're seeing is the attention of the media being focused entirely on this impeachment, the impeachment deal, what's going on, which is really so much less significant than the information that's in the Afghanistan papers and the character of this war that's gone on now. Really, the U.S. intervention began in 1979. It's 40 years now that this is going on, and it was that intervention that really created the conditions that, that over a period of decades brought us to where we are today. Brzezinski, who was then the National Security Advisor, told Carter, we can give the Soviet Union its Vietnam if we intervene now. And they intervened on the side of those elements who were burning teachers alive for the crime, the so-called crime of teaching girls to read and write, and children to read and write, and attempting to bring about those who are attempting to bring about land reform in the country. So we have this history that is almost entirely ignored, including to a large degree and almost entirely ignored in the Afghanistan papers. But the Afghanistan papers are very important for people to understand because it shows this is an adventure, that's gone on for all of these years that has absolutely no chance of succeeding in bringing about stability to Afghanistan. The war cannot be won. That's been clear for many, many years. There was the surge by Obama, the troop surge. That did not work. Now we have an airstrike surge going on where there were twice as many airstrikes last year. And who's suffering from this? It's the people of Afghanistan. And it's not going to end until there's an end of the U.S. occupation of that country.
John, let's talk about the fact that the papers are out there. And Sigar, the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, has been investigating how money's been spent in Afghanistan for more than a decade. But now we have names attached to who said what. We haven't seen much reaction from the Defense Department, from the Pentagon. Is there an upside to these people talking, or do they just kind of just simply let it go?
No, I think they're trying very much to control at least the media damage, the way that the Washington Post has portrayed what in many ways I think is unfortunately a non-story. Because we know that much of the information in the so-called Afghanistan papers, which are nothing like the Pentagon Papers, this was all unclassified information. It was available in a series of reports that were published in the Special Inspector General's website going back to 2014. 8 major reports that detailed much of the information in these so-called, Afghanistan papers. What's different is that the confidentiality of hundreds of people who've spoken to the Special Inspector General under terms of confidentiality are being exposed by the Washington Post.
So what's going to happen forward? Are people going to want to talk about things?
Well, it's human nature. It's a matter of incentives. Why would I, if I'm working in the government, speak to an Inspector General under terms of confidentiality if I believe that in 2 or 3 years the Washington Post is going to put my name out there and endanger my career? It's going to make it much more difficult for Inspectors General in the United States government to root out abuse, to root out fraud, if we have these types of fake stories coming out in the Washington Post sold as something far bigger than they really are. Anyone who had wanted to do the research could have found almost all of this in the Special Inspector General's website for the last 8 years.
Intizar, I saw you shaking your head at one point. Do you agree with what John just said, and what do you think the concerns are moving forward if the Pentagon or Defense Department does not come out and specifically address all these concerns?
Well, I think I was agree with John that these are not the new stuff that came out by Washington Post papers. It is the repetitive song we hear again, or it's a colorful movie we already watched, but that was black and white. I translated a book written by General Daniel Bolger, and he said that when Joe Biden came to Afghanistan, he asked the American soldier in Afghanistan and asked him that why you are here. A lot of American soldiers say that we do not know, but one soldier said that we came here for development, and that was also a wrong answer, because a soldier with a gun does not ensure development, but he destroy, and that's the mission of soldier around the world. I think that was completely a clear signal of the American soldiers to Joe Biden, and that was 2009. In the American government and also the international community, the United Nations, the Afghan government should have learned from all those mistakes. But we just turned blind eye toward that. So I think today nothing is new. We committed a number of mistakes here in Afghanistan, also in the war, also in development, and also in bringing peace. For example, arrogance and ignorance have been the two components that just add up back to the deterioration of the situation. Second, we focus on Kabul and forgot the rest of the provinces for bringing democracy, development in Afghanistan. And then we focus Afghanistan and forgot about the region where the terrorism has been fed. And today we are paying the prices, the 2,300 American soldiers who died in Afghanistan, the 20,000 more injured, and a lot of the 40 or 50,000 Afghan soldiers died. All these have been because of mistakes that would have been recovered in early stages. By the way, mistakenly, intentionally, or unintentionally, we turn blind eyes and then we pay the price today.
John, do you think that's accurate?
I think there's so much to be said about what's happened historically, where we are today, and how we avoid this kind of a situation going forward, both for the sake of the American people and our tax dollars being properly used by the U.S. government, by our politicians and our military to achieve achievable purposes in the national interest of the United States and our partners, but also to ensure that we are not doing great damage to parts of the world where we're responsible for the men, women, and children once we move in with, frankly, in this case, hundreds of billions of dollars, where neighboring countries are watching to see how the U.S. operates, and where, unfortunately, we still have power politics that does play out, as one of your panelists said. It's not just what's happening in Afghanistan, but Pakistan, India, China, Russia, Iran, they're all watching what's happening in Afghanistan. So there are significant geopolitical consequences here as well.
Gentlemen, I want you to listen to this. President Trump is expected to announce a withdrawal of nearly 4,000 troops from Afghanistan, and the talks resuming between the United States and the Taliban. This is what Secretary of Defense Mark Esper said he wants with this reduction. Listen to what he said.
I think we can go to a lower number in Afghanistan because the commander believes that he can conduct the all-important counterterrorism mission and train, advise, and assist so that we ensure that Afghanistan never again becomes a safe haven for terrorists.
Richard, I want to get your response to this. Is it going to be good to pull about 1/3 of the U.S. troops out of there?
I mean, for very, very many years, it's really been a situation where those troops are there and they're being asked to fight and die and kill for a lie and for a complete non-strategy as we can see from the Afghanistan Papers. That's what is made very, very clear, is that if your strategy is continually changing, you don't have a strategy. And there's no good intentions here. This is a part of global domination, of a strategy, of a much bigger strategy, not just related to Afghanistan, but a global strategy of domination. And what are U.S. troops doing all over the world? What are the U.S. troops doing in Afghanistan today that's going to lead anywhere positive? It's not going to. And so when we hear them say, well, we're going to reduce the number of troops, the United States needs to get out of Afghanistan. There is no possibility of bringing about a resolution that helps the people of that country or really solves the problems there. It has to be the people of Afghanistan who determine the future of Afghanistan.
Mushtaq, do you agree with Richard that there is no good intention, firstly? And secondly, if you talk to people, it comes down to the chicken or the egg. Do U.S. troops begin to pull out, or does the Taliban agree to a ceasefire? That has been the rub now for quite some time. How is that being viewed on the ground in Kabul? But first, I would like to hear from you if you believe there was any good intention over the last 18 years.
Well, I don't see it as a good intention. Rather, it's again the short-sighted attitude that has been practiced in Afghanistan over the years or over the decades. There is elections coming up in the United States, and the president of the United States, who is running again to win back his office for the second term, he had committed to the American people that he will pull back the forces. So it's not the people in Kabul see it from that perspective. Hopefully, the good side of it, or the fantasy side of it, could be that there must have been an agreement with the Taliban to show the good intention to them. As a part of confidence building measure, we will be drawing down. But I don't see that thing happening. Now, the short-sighted attitude does what? Everybody's focused on the American elections, and that's why Zalmay Khalilzad was in so much of rush in September 2018 to wrap up the whole conflict that has been going on for over 4 decades now in Afghanistan. Within the matter of a few months, he was vowing to sign a peace deal with the Taliban in March 2019, which did not happen, and nobody expected that to happen. So this short-sighted attitude is leaving a shaky ground for everyone with a situation where you cannot really trust what's going to happen next. Now, in terms of chicken and egg issue, definitely there has to be peace talks, there has to be agreements, and those agreements, at least before signing, there must be some verbal sort of agreement among the parties, including the intra-Afghan part of the whole negotiation process, before you talk about the drawdown, the pulling out of the Americans. Had it been about the numbers of the international forces, it has already come down from 130,000 to something in excess of 20,000 or even less than that.
Right.
So all in all, we don't see it as I personally believe it's more about the American elections rather than showing good intentions or building confidence between the Taliban and the Americans.
Okay, Mushtaq, thank you very much. Well, we could talk about this for a long time. Hopefully we shed some light on the issue in the past 30 minutes. I want to thank our panel very much for your insight. Before we go, we invite you to check out our podcast. You can listen through Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Stitcher, and Spotify. And we cover similar stories from around the world, but get a bit more personal and candid with our guests and correspondents. I'm Sean Calebs in Washington, D.C. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find The Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.